Good evening. Oh, it is good to be in the house of the Lord. Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for meeting with us. Thank you for hearing our cry, even before we cried it out, making a way so that we could come to you. Meet with us here tonight. Let your word go forth. Let us be open to receive it. Let us hear from you. Let it make a difference and a change in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Some quick encouragement tonight. Probably not going to take too long. But I'm going to do something that I don't do very often. And that is, my text for the evening comes from the Old Testament. Yeah, I've gone back to the Old Testament. Something I don't do very often. At least not to the main text. That's Exodus chapter 17. We'll start with verse 8. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. So a few things I would like to focus on regarding this text. First, a little encouragement. This is the way God likes to operate. He likes to operate along these lines so that He gets the glory. Big deal for Israel. Here comes a major enemy. They're in trouble. These are not trained soldiers, at least not at this point in time. It would come to pass later down the road that Israel would have quite an army. But at this point in time, they don't have an army. He didn't say, get the army. He said, choose some men to go fight. Okay? These were just whoever was able-bodied enough to do some fighting. And while it doesn't give the details there, we get the idea that Moses heard from God about what to do. He told Joshua to get the men and go out to meet the Amalekites. And he knew that he was going up above them, and he was going to hold the rod that God had given him up over the battle. And the Lord would do the fighting. Yes, the men that were chosen did their part. But it was the Lord that made them victorious. That was exemplified first by the fact that when Moses dropped the rod, lowered the rod, Israel stopped winning the war. There's a couple of things about that. I may be reading a little into this. But first, quite often, we see the enemy out there. The fight that we're going to have to fight. You know, how are we going to get the bills paid? Whatever it is, this enemy that we see that is greater than us. It's just overwhelming just to look into the future and see it on the horizon and know we're about to have to face it. It just exhausts us looking at it. We're going to get creamed. This is going to hurt. And if we march out to fight that battle, chances are good we were right. We're going to get creamed. But when we're walking with God and following His direction and His lead, and we're where He wants us to be, and we surrender our lives and the care of our lives to Him, He's the one that fights the battles. We don't have to face the enemy alone. We have a mighty warrior who fights on our behalf. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything. Moses had his part in obedience to what God told him to do. And when you compare it to actually doing the fighting, let's face it, standing there holding a stick in the air, not that big of a deal. Pretty small thing to have to do when you compare it to hand-to-hand combat with swords and, having to actually do the battle. And those guys who were doing the fighting were blessed and strengthened and made more skillful somehow by the power of God. But that doesn't mean that what Moses was doing was easy. Just because it wasn't the hard part, because God was doing the hard part, doesn't mean it wasn't easy for him. And what God calls us to do to obey Him, at times take everything we've got and more. I dare say that if everyone here were to take their hands and hold them up just a little over shoulder level, even without a stick, without a rod, long before I get done preaching tonight, even though I have no intention on going very long, those hands would probably drop. I know I can't do it for very long. My back is already killing me. It takes a lot out of you to just stand there with your hands in the air. And Moses knew that he was going to need some help. God told him what to do. And he knew that that was not any great feat. That God would get the glory, because let's face it, holding a stick over your head is not a big, glorious thing. God was going to get the glory for the battle. But he also knew that he might need help. He did not go up there alone. He took Aaron and Hur with him. They were there by his side. Now, I don't know if God told Moses, if you let the stick down, you're going to lose my blessing. If you don't hold the rod up, you're going to lose. I don't know. I don't have a clue. It doesn't say. That would be complete supposition. My guess is, if Moses had known, once again, supposition, guess, that Aaron and Hur would have been grabbing his arms before the rod went down the first time. Because what it says there in verse 11, and it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. That means they were winning. They were beating the Amalekites. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. That means Israel was losing. That's kind of abstract, so let me put it a different way. Men that Moses had led out of bondage were dying in the desert because he dropped his hands. That was serious. So he put them back up. But his hands were heavy. His arms were tired. Now, I don't know if he had it in both hands or if he was holding it up with one hand and switching it over to the other and trying to do that juggle thing to keep it up. My guess is he had the rod in both hands because he had two helpers after that. It doesn't say whether Moses asked Aaron and Hur, hey, get over here and help me hold my arms up because I can't do it. Or if Aaron and Hur, out of loving compassion and understanding that Moses needed some help to do what God had told him to do, stepped in and did it without being asked. But what it does say is that Aaron stepped in on one side, Hur stepped in on the other. They gave Moses a place to sit, and they held his arms with the rod of the Lord up. Now Moses was holding the rod. Aaron and Hur were holding Moses. They were holding his arms. They did not do what God had told Moses to do. They did not take the rod from him. Aaron didn't hold the rod. Hur didn't hold the rod. But they helped Moses to be able to do what God had called him to do. And because of that, he was able to do what he was told to do the rest of the time that he needed to do it, and Israel won the war by the power of God. And my encouragement tonight is on a few quick points. First, when you see the enemy coming, let's go back to 8 real quick. Then came Amalek. Israel didn't go out and pick this fight. They would do that with some others later. But this time, Amalek came to them. When you see the enemy coming, you don't have to be afraid. God said He would be our warrior. He will fight our battles. But that doesn't mean that we get to sit down on the sidelines with our hands in our pockets, waiting for God to mop up our enemy so that we can step in and get the spoils of war. Every time God called His people to war and said, I'm going to fight the battle for you, He told them to do something. In some things, it was put the praise and worshipers and the musicians in front of the soldiers and march them to the enemy. With Gideon and his, it was put some torches in some pots and break the pots and yell. That's not much. But if they hadn't done it, the enemy wouldn't have been routed. With Jericho, it was march around the city. Circle the city and march around the city. With Amalek, it was pick some men to go out and face the enemy, and Moses, you go up on the hill with the rod. And hold the rod out over the battle, and I will fight for you. So while we don't need to be afraid when we see the enemy coming, we do need to be quick to say, Father, I know you've got the fight, but what's my part? What do you want me to do? I trust you, and I know that you want from me what I can give. It may not be much. It may be holding a torch up. But whatever it is that you want me to do, it may just be praising your name as I go out to face the enemy with the soldiers behind me instead of in front of me. Doesn't make any sense to do that. But if that's what you want, I'll do it. When you're facing the enemy, when you're facing a time of difficulty, don't do it alone. We're never alone. God is always with us. God is always for us. But He has not called us into a walk of isolation. We are not isolated. Jesus said, "They will know that you are my disciples by your love for one another." That means we're supposed to have fellowship with one another. We're supposed to have associations with other people that are fellow believers that can stand in the gap with us and pray. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to invite them over to your house and they have to be right there with you when the enemy comes. It could mean getting on the phone, shooting a text, getting on Facebook, getting on a prayer request after church, whatever it is. The enemy is coming. The battle is the Lord's, but the battle is about to happen, and I need some help. I need some prayer requests, people, some prayer warriors to stand on my behalf. I need some people to just understand that I'm about to go into battle. Even though God's going to do the fighting, you just need to know that I'm going through something. There's no shame in that. We need to let go of our pride. This idea of whatever it is God's told me to do, I can do this on my own. Forget that. We are supposed to help one another. So be quick to grab your Aaron and your Hur and say, "Walk with me up the mountain where God has called me to do." But remember, Moses did not give either Aaron or Hur the rod. God told Moses to hold the rod, and Moses held the rod. Aaron and Hur helped Moses. When we ask our brothers and sisters in the Lord to stand in the gap with us, it's not standing in the gap for us. We still need to do what God has told us to do. Not pawn it off on somebody else. I suspect that if Moses had gotten tired and handed Aaron the rod, that Israel would have gotten beat. Or at least for as long as it took Moses to realize that that was as bad as lowering his hands and grab the rod back. Get help, but don't abdicate your obedience. Continue to be faithful in what God has told you to do. And one other aspect, whenever you can, whether you're asked or whether you simply see the need, be an Aaron, be a Hur. Be there for a brother or a sister who's going into battle. You know they're going in. Hey, I'm going to walk with you up this mountain. I don't know what God's called you to do. I don't know what He's told you to do. Oh, you do? Okay, good. I'm not going to do it for you because He didn't tell me to do it. He told you to do it. But if you need some help, I'm here. I'll be praying for you. I'll be praying about the battle. Be an Aaron and a Hur for somebody. Be quick to step in and grab their arms and hold them up when you realize they're too tired to keep going on. Even when God's doing the fighting, we can get exhausted. We can get wiped out. It may seem like no big deal in the history book for Moses to be holding a stick over his head. It wasn't as tough as the guys swinging swords. But he just didn't have the strength to do it. It took everything he had and then some. And sometimes what God has called us to do takes everything we have and then some. And His grace is sufficient for the and then some. But sometimes we're supposed to be somebody else's grace. That's what Aaron and Hur were. Moses couldn't do it. His hands were heavy. He needed grace to do what he was called to do. He could not do it in his own power and his own strength. It was impossible. And because of that, the battle was going to be lost. He needed grace. And this is Old Testament example of grace. Aaron and Hur stepped in and strengthened him. They were a way for God to extend grace to Moses. So don't be afraid of the battle. Turn to God. Find out what He wants you to do. Be obedient. Don't go into it alone. And if it's not your battle, and somebody asks for help or you just see them going through it, be grace for somebody and step in and help them. A little lesson from the war with the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17. Father, I thank you that you fight our battles for us. But that's so we can understand you more. You call us to participate. That you do require our participation in our own deliverance. That while it doesn't take anything more than all we have, it does take all we have to serve you and to obey you. And that when it takes more than that, your grace is sufficient. Thank you for brothers and sisters that can help us, that can help be your grace. Let us not be afraid to ask for help. And let us be filled with your love for one another so that we are quick to help others and we can be a taste of grace for someone whose hands and heart are heavy. Father, let us remember that if we are walking with you, we are where you have called us to be. And the enemies of the land, even if it was their land before you called us into it, will not prevail against us because you will fight the battles. But let us be quick to ask for your help, quick to obey. And remember that we are not to do it alone. We don't isolate from the fellowship. Thank you, Father. Seal this word in our hearts. In Jesus' name. Amen.